raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub, spotting celestial alignments that match the coming and going of the solstices, observed since ancient times by peoples the world over, and of course also observing all of the current happenings in the world of archaeology. Always a lot to discuss, and joining me as always right here as we pony up, pour a glass, and gather for some conversation is my good pal, my good friend, my cohort, my colleague, Jason Pentrail. Sir, how are you?
I am live from the surface of the sun, where we are redefining what it means to be in the sweet sunny South. It is about 108 degrees here today.
Oh my gosh, that is no joke. I lied earlier. I told you here in Asheville, where it's normally a bit cooler, I said it's about 90 degrees. No, I was off by a degree. It's 91.
You made it. You made it officially into the 90s. Well, I'll tell you, we are celebrating the summer solstice at the beginning of this episode, and no finer way to do it than for it to be hot outside, right? What kind of summer solstice would it be if it weren't scorching hot here in the South?
Yeah, indeed. You know, there's this ancient tradition, and again, I am fascinated with the solstices. I even did an article over there at thedebrief.org for the solstice this year that actually focused on archaeology, because people in the ancient world were obviously very aware of this longest day of the year. Of course, in more southerly hemispheres, it's the shortest day of the year. This marks the arrival of their, winter. But for us, we're entering summer. It's the longest day of the year. And, we look at Neolithic societies in parts of Europe. They would build bonfires, right? Obviously in recognition of the sun and trying to kind of, produce heat and flame and fire in our own way. I'm also thinking, though, when it's 90 degrees outside, the last thing I want to do is what these European traditions often entail, which was building bonfires and making things any hotter than they actually are, right? It's already plenty hot enough as it is, wouldn't you say?
Believe it or not, I actually like to bring in the summer solstice with a bonfire as well. As a matter of fact, I do it on both equinoxes and both solstices. However, it's usually at about 9 o'clock at night once the sun is good and down and it cools off a bit. And needless to say, it's just a small fire pit, but good for roasting marshmallows and for bringing in each time of the year. So summer, has its own rewards. It's always fun, especially the kids seem to love it. As you know, you and I both share a love of fall time when it's cool in the mornings and crisp at night. That's my preferred time of the year. I've never been much of a summer guy, even though I'm from Charleston. The humidity and the heat just really gets to me, but nonetheless, it's always fun to welcome a new season. And we like to do it around our household, just as a little fun celebration and a kind of time to focus on all the great things for each time of the year.
Oh, yeah, certainly. And, again, the solstice is a very important observation when it comes to archaeology. I've already mentioned, ancient societies the world over that have observed the solstice and had an awareness of it. But, for you and I, we've gone to a lot of sites over the years. And by the way, James Waldo is currently traveling. So if you haven't heard from our resident geologist, that's the only reason why. He'll, of course, be back in pocket in the days ahead. He's currently out there doing a little traveling with some colleagues, so we'll have a full update from him at some point in the future. But Jason and I here, ponying up at the pub, as we have often done in the past together. And in fact, in our travels, we have visited sites where there is an obvious and unequivocal connection with the, celestial setting or rising of the sun in recognition of the summer solstice. One that obviously comes to mind, the Serpent Mound there in Ohio, which on the day of the summer solstice, the sun sets directly into the open mouth of the serpent, which always struck me as fascinating.
Yeah, it's just one of many sites. Oftentimes, I'll get emails or people writing to me on behalf of the show and asking about astral alignments in different sites throughout the nation. In fact, I just had one last week where someone was asking me about a particular mound complex up near the Serpent Mound and whether or not I knew if there were any astral alignments. Unfortunately, I didn't know that much about that particular site. It was a lesser known area that's close to the Serpent Mound, but nonetheless still very interesting. And, I've had the opportunity to get over to Stonehenge. I had the opportunity to spend time at Avebury. And both of those sites, have many, many alignments, obviously. And each time of the year is marked there with festivals and interactions. And, I think it's one of those things in life, especially in modern day times, that just gets overlooked. It kind of gets lost. But I am a big fan, as you know, of ritual and tradition. And I think there's something to be said for just taking a moment to recognize the change in the seasons, to sort of welcome in that time of year and kind of reflect on the things to be done, what lies ahead, and kind of reflect on the season of the past. So again, a lot of people, I understand you get caught up in your daily life and lots of things going on, but it's nice to kind of, throw back for those of us who love history and all of the things that go, the regalia that goes along with history. Kind of feel sometimes that our modern rituals are too fast paced. So it's nice to kind of back up and slow down and just kind of think about what we've just been through in a season and what lies ahead as we welcome a new time each year.
Well, I would think that for anthropologists especially, observing ritual would be meaningful because, that's what so much of anthropology entails. Also, with regard to archaeology, we look at artifacts that seem to have ritual significance. Now, I know a lot of people probably roll their eyes and think, as a modern technological society, with all the knowledge that science affords us, we don't need rituals anymore. But I'll tell you about my daily ritual. I do it every morning. I make that coffee, and I have a little quiet time before the madness of the day ensues. Humans have seemed to kind of evolve in a lot of ways to sort of need ritual, right? We have the ritual of gathering together and dining. We have the ritual of observing holidays. Even people who are more of the secular bent still observe a lot of holidays that are traditionally religious, and they may strip out the religion, or many people still observe those things. To each their own. But we all tend to observe different kinds of rituals. We recognize this day in commemoration of this event, or we get together and we observe this practice on this date. Yeah, humans tend, I think, to need rituals, maybe more than a lot of people would admit. And so for my own part, that's really just a fun way of being able to incorporate an awareness of the things that are happening around us, and whether it be the longest day of the year, whether it be the shortest day of the year, whether it be, a holiday, what have you. I think that that's just a fun way to just kind of, get away from the grind, so to speak, and remember that we are humans and that not much has really changed since the ancient way of life that we still actually see represented in the archaeological record. But I was recently going back, Jason, and looking through Edwin Krupp's book, that excellent book, Echoes of the Ancient Skies, which is really kind of a cornerstone in the discipline of archaeoastronomy. And Krupp is talking about some of those incredible celestial alignments that have been recognized at sites like Stonehenge that you mentioned, but others that include, for instance, Machu Picchu. And in that Temple of the Sun, there are often sites within sites, locations at various different ancient archaeological ruins and sites and what have you, that are designated as a so-called Temple of the Sun because of these kinds of alignments that you find. But there at Machu Picchu, there's a really interesting story that began to unfold back in 1980. A couple of archaeologists, Ray White and David Dearborn, had been visiting as part of the what's known as the Earthwatch expedition, which they still do annually. And apparently while they were there, they were taking measurements of the so-called Torion, that being the Temple of the Sun there at Machu Picchu. And what they found was really interesting. Now, there's this northeastern window that obviously coincides with the rising of the sun on the day of the solstice. That much was pretty evident. But what they also found was that there was a kind of a flat vertical surface that appeared on an altar adjacent to that window, and that the shadow of a weighted strand, if one were to suspend a single string or strand in that window, would have perfectly cut the surface of that altar. And they theorized, and so does Krupp, that this would have marked the date of the solstice. So not only is there a celestial alignment, but there also appeared to be the remnants of an altar that was clearly used to actually mark that date and as a sort of a timekeeping device for recognizing the solstices. So I just find that really fascinating that there's this scientific and astronomical component that we find at a lot of these ancient sites. So again, in recognizing the solstice, It is literally the continuation of an ancient astronomical and timekeeping practice that has been observed all around the world. That, to me, just is fascinating.
Yeah, again, these rituals, as we look back through time, they've always been important, not just for agriculture and ceremonialism, but as just a way of interacting with nature. And so, with my own life and my own family, for us, it's just a way to take a quiet moment away from the ritual of checking your cell phone 63 times an hour and just, learning to slow down, focus, and do a little bit of reflection. Nothing too extravagant, but just a quiet moment. And it also makes for a nice family activity. There's lots of little crafts and things and foods that you can have along with these little simple celebrations that, especially for children, help them slow down and kind of look at the world around them. So that's one of the reasons that we do it. And again, this is something that goes back to the beginning of human existence, tracking the stars, tracking the sun, tracking the moon, and interacting with nature on that very human level, which is important. It's important to stop and reflect and look at the world around you. And I think it's something that needs to continue as we move forward. Technology is great. I'm not one of those people who's down on it, but everything in moderation, including moderation.
Yeah, everything in moderation, including smartphones and social media. Again, what you're talking about, the constant flipping, swiping, checking the phone. We have become so glued to that. We've been engineered to want to look at that phone. And people will complain from time to time, Micah, you're hard to get a hold of. You never answer your phone. I can tell you right now, ladies and gents, there's a good reason why, because I have to put that phone away so that I, A, don't lose my mind, but also so that I, B, maintain, sort of a sense for the natural faculties that we as humans have without always being reliant on those devices. I think that sometimes it can be a little destructive. At very least, it's invasive. I choose to leave that out. And so, yeah, build the bonfire, celebrate however you like to, make some good food. Also, make sure that if you're going to be involving yourself in those kinds of things, an observance of a day or a holiday or a tradition, I like to try and incorporate some history in there. With my kids, one day, I don't have kids yet, Jason, but one day I hope to do that. I hope to teach them about history. And of course, we've got some great friends just over the Tennessee border there who help to teach people about history. That's our buddy Chase Pipes and the folks at the Smoky Mountain Relic Room. What are they up to recently? You've been there more recently than I have, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've mentioned it a few times now, but it is much bigger than it used to be. They have a whole new section for dinosaur bones and minerals and crystals and all of the wonderful things that they offer there at the Relic Room inside of the Smoky Mountain Knife Works. That is in Sevierville, Tennessee. It is in the gateway to all of the things that you want to go there to see. Gatlinburg, Smoky Mountain National Park. It's a great way to kick off those trips. And speaking of trips, it is time once again for the annual summer trip with Chase and his son Isaac. They have made their way out west through Texas, ghost towns, looking for fossil fish, and they are out there just doing what they do. We've said it before. Isaac Pipes is a very lucky young man to have a dad who's so passionate about history. And every year they head out west to do what they do, which is an action-packed adventure, filming new episodes of Chasing History. And speaking of those new episodes of Chasing History, they do have a brand new video that they've just posted on the YouTube channel for Peterson Mounds. Now, this was the first stop on our spring tour, Chasing History, 7 Ages Research Associates out on the road. This was the first stop that we've made. They've got an over hour-long video of all the highlights of the Peterson Mounds site, featuring State Park Ranger Deidre Irwin, as well as myself, and Chase Pipes hosting. So go over there and check out Chasing History. We will be putting that video up on our 7 Ages page on YouTube here shortly, along with the new episode from Peterson Mounds of our show, the 7 Ages Audio Journal. And speaking of which, I've been getting a lot of feedback on that particular site. A lot of people saying they had not heard of it before. They were very excited to hear about everything that that site has to offer. I've had quite a few emails and comments on social media of people being very excited about the new episode. And so we are happy once again to be able to present to you tonight a new episode, part 2 of that. Again, I will be accompanied by Chase Pipes, and this time we were joined by geologist extraordinary and co-host of the 7 Ages Audio Journal, James Waldo. So he was able to get out of work there in Arkansas and join us at Spiro Mounds. And again, Chase was heading the charge. He was getting us out there to where we needed to be on all the sites. He drove the entire time in the Tundrasaur, his brand new vehicle. And so, yes, we did make it out there to Spiro, and we got to spend the day with Dennis Peterson, who is the archaeologist and director of the Spiro Mounds Archaeological Center. He gave us a fantastic tour of all of the facilities, the entire museum, all of the grounds, and then sat down to give us an outstanding interview that we have for you tonight. So once again, we thank our sponsor, the Smoky Mountain Relic Room, Sevierville, Tennessee, and you can always find more at therelicroom.com, the largest diversity of history for sale in North America.
Indeed, always working to educate the public, and we really appreciate our brother Chase and what he does. My only regret, of course, is not being able to join you guys out there on the road recently, because I adore Chase and always have a great time. So many fond memories of sitting out there enjoying a nice autumn brew by a bonfire and talking about archaeology with you, Chase, and everybody else until the wee hours. I really miss that and hope to get back out there. For those of you, by the way, who enjoy building a fire, cracking open a cold one, kicking back and listening to this podcast, be sure also to check us out on social media. We are on Instagram. We are on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. And of course, you can always find all the links to everywhere we are over there at 7ages.org. Now, Jason, before we get into the interview this week, I thought it would be important to touch on something that I know that you and our guest, Dennis Peterson, will be talking about. Sadly, I wasn't able to make it to this interview. I always hate missing interviews. My schedule is so crazy these days that it's kind of hit or miss. And so Jason's been really talking about leading the charge. You've been leading the charge with all these interviews, keeping the Patreon going. I have been all over the place, but always try to make it home so that we can be a part of this. It's important, and so many of you guys out there are a part of this too. And so we like to, when we get together and we talk, address important issues in archaeology on this show, obviously. And one of the most important that has really been the case for as long as there has been a science of archaeology has been the problem of looting. And that is really one of the main issues that we face, and which, of course, I'm sure you and Dennis Peterson will be addressing with the discussion about the Spiro Mounds. Mr. Peterson is the archaeologist and director at Spiro Mounds. It's arguably one of the most important archaeology sites that there is. And sadly, it was also essentially destroyed when looters went in there and used dynamite to blow open the mounds and retrieve, again, irreplaceable artifacts that would have given us a very important window into the lives and the cultures of ancient people, had it not been for the fact that they were removed, taken away, sold, put in private collections. In any case, now we can't establish their provenance. There's no way to retrieve that. That is a part of our past, a part of the North American, indigenous American past that is forever lost. And to me, that is a tremendous tragedy. And so, although we'll never get that back, I think it's so important that you go and you talk to people like Dennis as you do, that people, when they travel to these sites, remember, if we don't preserve the past, if we don't preserve the history and the prehistory of ancient cultures and the way of life in those ancient times, those kinds of things, you don't ever get them back. And that's part of the mission that we try to achieve, that we seek to try and always drive home in discussions like this here on this podcast.
Yeah, certainly Spiro is of absolute significant importance to the history of North America. The site is brilliantly placed. It was planned out. There was so much ceremony that happened there, so many generations of people who lived on that site. And really, you're going to learn from this interview just how important of a center for the Mississippian culture that Spiro was. Strategically placed, it was the door, the gateway to the west, and it worked both ways with artifacts coming and going. From the west to the east, from the east to the west. It was at a very strategic area and extremely important part of North American history. I think you're going to be surprised, if you don't know that much about the site, how just important Spiro really was to the story of North American history. And Dennis, fantastic interview and really thorough. He's been at the site over 30 years dedicated to the Spiro Mounds. And so in this interview, you will see that reflected, and his expertise really shines through. We are excited to sit down with him, and he is an excellent guest for the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Well, let's wait no longer. Coming up here in a moment, Dennis Peterson sits down with Jason Pentrail right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
So, as the spring tour continues out on the road with Chasing History and 7 Ages, we have made our way to one of the most significant Mississippian sites in all of North America, the Spiro Complex. We are joined today by archaeologist Dennis Peterson. He is currently the manager of the Spiro Mounds Archaeological Center. A native Oklahoman, Mr. Peterson went to the University of Oklahoma for his BA in anthropology and also for his master's degree work. While at the University of Oklahoma, Dennis was able to work in various capacities for the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey and especially on the Spiro Mound excavations, which were conducted from 1979 to 1982. Dennis continued to work for the survey on other projects, including the Spiro Mounds Prehistoric Gateway, Present-Day Enigma exhibit with the Sam Noble Oklahoma Museum of Natural History. The love of Spiro Mound site and his interest in the interpretation of prehistory to the public led Dennis to leave Norman with his wife, Rhonda, and become the manager of the Spiro Mounds Archaeological Center in 1985. He and his wife have lived in Spiro ever since. In 2008, a revamping of the main exhibit gallery at the center was opened. With much of the design and almost all of the information from his research in 2009, the new exhibits won an Outstanding Interpretive Exhibit Award from the Oklahoma Museums Association. Dennis, welcome to the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you. It's good to be involved with this project.
Yeah, well, we certainly appreciate it. Now, we've had a little bit of time to chat with you here at the site this morning, and you're a wealth of information, and so we're very much looking forward to getting into the discussion here today. Now, what we're going to talk about is not just the Spiro site, but we have the rare opportunity with you, Dennis, to have someone who has an overview picture of how the Mississippian way of life, that techno-complex, that culture all sort of seamlessly work together, the different areas of influence, and really get into a conversation about who the Mississippians were and kind of how all the politics and the movement of goods kind of came together into one conversation. So we're very much looking forward to that. And then in the latter half, we're going to focus right on this site at Spiro and talk about all the details of this incredible archaeological complex. So with that being said, I think it's a really good idea to just start right at the beginning. For those who may just have pieces and parts of the Mississippian story, when we hear that term Mississippian in terms of indigenous populations, what are we talking about?
The Mississippian is a confederation of over 60 different tribes, over 30 different language groups, directly involving over 6 million people and controlling everywhere from the Rockies to the Virginia coast, from the Gulf Coast of Florida to the Great Lakes. It occurs from about 700 AD till around 1500 AD that you have what we call the Mississippian culture in general. Now, that's very complex. The Mississippian is highly interconnected by the waterways. Before Europeans come in, of course, the only 2 ways of movement. You either walk, which is never efficient, or you took a boat. The boats are dugouts, pirogues. The big transport boats ran from 30 to 60 feet long. Some have sails, some hold up to 80 people or more. So if you control a river system, a pinch point, if you would, you are in command of that river. And that was especially the case here at the Arkansas River Basin, where Spiro controls this particular point. By control of the Arkansas River at this point in eastern Oklahoma, it allowed Spiro to have the toll booth on the I-40 of the past. Anything moving east to west or west to east had to stop here and had to be extracted tribute from. And that was a vast control zone. There are tens of thousands of mound sites created during this period. The vast majority of those are single mound sites. Mounds are nothing more than a way of saying, look at me, I'm in charge and you're not. King on the hill. Now, the vast majority of those mound sites are single mound sites. One mound created for a building to be placed on, and that building operates kind of like a county seat, control 10, 15, 20 towns around it. They in turn are controlled by bigger centers, which operate like state capitals, and then they in turn are controlled by the big 4, the 4 regional centers. Spiro, because it controls the Arkansas and through subsidiaries, the Red River Valley, controlled the west. Moundville in Alabama controlled the south central. Etowah in Georgia controlled the southeast. Cahokia in East St. Louis controls the north central. Now, each of those was autonomous but interconnected. And at least from about 1100 on, Spiro is the glue that held that system together. They did so in part by creating ambassadors, so folks from Spiro that were stationed strategically, either in big cities or major resource areas, and then to tie them together, they create the only pan-tribal writing system for the U.S. prehistorically, which is the conch shell engravings that we see here at the site. That iconography, picture writing, allowed for them to standardize the basic religious, political, and social ideas for the Mississippian peoples. It gave them unity. So everything from how the world was created, where first fire comes from, major ceremonies like the busk or green corn, rattlesnake dance, black drink ceremony, heroes like Redhorn and Morning Star, monsters like Yuctana and Tawana, those are all depicted in the art, not just for their own use, but to hold together this national confederation so that everybody's singing off the same song card. And that is what was necessary. I mean, this is a confederation, not a nation. So you can't force people to follow you. You have to reinforce. Well, the more differences there are between one group, say the groups like the Muskogee and the people here in the Caddoan area, the more likely it is they're not going to get along with one another. But by creating this framework, this art that is information, it allowed Spiro and the other major players, it's not only them, but they're where it all ends up at. It allowed for the leaders at Spiro to share an ideology. It's their equivalent of the Bible. And so as a result, it gave a fundamental connection among these very diverse, extremely widespread populations that allowed for the Mississippian to be so powerful and so connected and joined. The folks who were here at Spiro eventually become the Caddoan-speaking groups that we call the Wichita and the Caddo. But their reach was so much more than that. In fact, it's ironic, the folks here in eastern Oklahoma, west Arkansas, who were the Caddoan speakers, eventually controlled most of the United States. Coordinated would probably be a better word. But eventually, after European intrusion, those tribes that had occupied the rest of the eastern U.S. end up occupying the Spiro leadership joint area. And so it's kind of interesting how that transference from the east to the west is why the folks here at Spiro were also 500 years earlier so influential, because they were able to link those folks together. Now when they move into Oklahoma or Indian Territory, they have some aspects that are similar, and it comes out of that Mississippian tradition.
Yeah, it's all absolutely fascinating. And as we were beginning the discussion with you this morning before we sat down to talk here on the mic, it really began to meld together just how many political parties there would have been, how many important pieces of the puzzle there were to the Mississippian world, much more advanced than anything that we had seen previously. You kind of hint at it during the woodland, and it's working its way up to this stabilized, sort of ritualistic, ceremonial idea that begins to develop in the Mississippian world. So let's talk about that for a moment. Now, what is it that drives the sort of settlement of the Mississippian people and the building of these ritual centers, and how does that all interplay together?
Well, across the southern half of the United States, around 700 AD, the U.S. experienced an incredibly lush period of time. Not just more rain, but a much more predictable rainfall pattern. So 6 to 8 years out of every decade were coming out as great producers, massive amounts of resources, surplus, and elites develop because of that. Your population increases, elites will come out of that to be able to coordinate those individuals in just getting more and more powerful. From California to Virginia, from the northern part of Mexico to southern Colorado, that entire southern half of the U.S. was experiencing this time of plenty. Well, when all these good things were going on, the elites are saying, you know why it's going on? Why we're having all this great stuff? It's because of us. We're the ones who communicate with the spiritual world. We're the ones who coordinate all of you lowly farmers. We're the ones who create the storage facilities that when bad times come, we'll be able to pull on to figure out what the problem is, but to fix it as well. And that's what drives this Mississippian. I mean, not just the Mississippian. If you look in the Southwest, the Anasazi and the Hohokam, groups like that were throughout the southwestern part of the U.S. are experiencing this same environmental change and population increases and more sophisticated political structures to hold on to them. Now, the problem for the Southwest is that they're a more marginal environmental area anyway, even during the time of plenty. So the amount of resources they can produce and the fact that they have very few riverine traveling ability, it's all on foot, which means you can't carry very much, which means your interconnectivities have to be non-commodities per much. In the East, though, you've got these big boats carrying huge amounts of material, especially maize. See, when this environmental shift occurs, one of the things that becomes important, especially to the big cities like Cahokia, Moundville, Etowah, is maize, corn. It was reintroduced at about 700 to 800 AD into the U.S. It originally had been here about 400 AD, domesticated in central Mexico. But it's coming in because it's going from farmer to farmer to farmer as this environmental stability was occurring. The nice thing about maize is it's highly prolific. In other words, one seed produces huge amounts of material. It's also very storable. You can have it sit on a shelf 6, 8, 10 years on the shelf and still have 60 to 80% germination rate. But it's a terrible food to depend heavily on. It has an importance because it's a high carbohydrate density, but it's so dense our stomachs can't process it very well. So the big cities like Cahokia, it's somewhere around 35 to 50,000 people, bigger than any city in Europe at the same time, was the New York City for the Mississippian peoples. But it had to depend heavily upon maize, which meant, on average, lower life expectancies, smaller body size because of all the stresses that are involved with this high carbohydrate, low plant proteins, problems with digestibility, all sorts of issues.
So in terms of like Spiro's influence and really success as a settlement, what is it in context of the physiographic region here? Why is it where it is, and why is that important, and how did that help them become successful in the way that they did?
Well, all the sites, all the major sites, become influential, powerful, because of the river systems that they're on. The rivers are your highways. They always have been up until we have a highway system and a railroad. Until that point, if you weren't along a river, you couldn't get goods and services. So by control of the Arkansas River, it gave Spiro a link not only to the west, all the way to the Colorado, all the way to the Panhandle of Texas, but it also meant a link for the entirety of the eastern two-thirds of the U.S. You can get anywhere in the eastern U.S. by boat in 5 weeks or so with a lot of stuff. And that is economically the power of Spiro and the other major players. Now, why Spiro is on the Arkansas at this particular point in eastern Oklahoma is because the Arkansas cuts through a limestone ridge here. So part of it's to the north, what we call Wilson Rock. Down here it's called Swallow Rock. It's about a mile wide. That width meant that at that particular point, it's narrowed down and it becomes economically a toll booth on the I-40 of the past. It also means that agriculturally, this is the most fertile bottomland area in the Arkansas Basin. Because the Arkansas, when it's coming down the river system from the west to the east, at this point, it's a pinch point. So it narrows down the flow of the river. That means when it's down here on the downslope, the downstream portion of it, when the river goes into flood, the energy, the destructive forces, go over into what we call the Pawpaw Bottoms. It's on the north side of the river. So that gets all the destruction. This area would have had the backwater. It's also kind of a shadow zone when you get this. It's kind of like a bend in a river today. It goes slower when you go around that bend. And that means that the silts drop out here on this bottom. Both the east and west of this pinch point, all the silts out there that come down the Arkansas are dropping out onto the fertile bottomland area, and that makes it the most fertile bottomland area in the Arkansas Basin. What that means for the folks here at Spiro is that you can have a city of somewhere around 7,000 to 10,000 people for well over 1,000 years, continuously farming the bottoms and being able to have them rejuvenated regularly so that you don't ever have to really move out of this area. You don't overuse the source, and it's all because of the Arkansas and all because of this particular point on the Arkansas River.
Dennis, as we get into that, I want to try to make sure that we cover, not only Spiro at this portion, but all of the major centers. Do we see something very similar at Etowah, Moundville, and Cahokia?
Oh, yeah. Cahokia, of course, is right on the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri River valleys. So that's what we call the American Bottoms. Hugely productive, and that's because the Mississippi comes down from the north, huge amount of catchment, so it's got a lot of silts. But when the Missouri is coming out of the west, it dumps those silts and flows into the Mississippi right there at St. Louis. In fact, there were about 100 mounds in where downtown St. Louis is now, although there's only one still standing. In fact, St. Louis is built on Indian mounds. It flattened out to be able to create that. So across the river in East St. Louis, Collinsville, is where Cahokia is located. You end up with over 120 mounds, the biggest of which is Monk's Mound. It's bigger, has a base area bigger than any pyramid in Egypt or in Mexico, over 100 feet high in its largest point, hugely important. It's the New York City to Spiro's Washington, D.C. The reason why it could have that population, in part, is because of that confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi, that resource, those silts coming off of the Missouri, upper portion of it, and the upper portion of the Mississippi as well. So by control of that river, it gave them great influence on anybody going south out of that point, as well as those going to the north on resources. Now, for the Etowah is on the Etowah River, just outside of Atlanta. It has a similar situation as we do, as being not a huge river, but it is an important one to link between the Gulf and that Appalachians area. The Black Warrior River is what Moundville is located on, and has a similar type of structure. It's that connecting up to the Ohio River mostly. The Ohio is an important river system trading out of that northeastern part of the U.S., but it also allows for them to be able to have access along the Ohio, down the Mississippi, and be able to trade with their influence area, which is the southern Mississippi Basin as well.
One of the fascinating things that the analogies that you use is that analogy of, Spiro is like Washington, D.C., as opposed to Cahokia is New York City. It's not as big of a site, but it is much more important than these other, major sites. And my question is that you've got trade coming in, materials coming in from all over the country. And these rivers are these navigable highways. What kind of stuff do you have coming in from different parts of the world to this site?
From the west, you have bison material, bison scapula, tibia, furs, hides, meat. You have stone like K County flint, which is highly desired because you have incredibly thin, extremely sharp, huge blades that are made out of that material, out of the flint hills of southern Kansas, northern Oklahoma. You have Alabates quarry material, which is from the Alabates quarry, is outside of Amarillo. And you can go by boat, not year-round, but throughout the year, along the Canadian River, and be about 20 miles to the north when you get to the panhandle of Texas. You're about 20 miles from Alabates. Alabates was important because that becomes a median area, a frontier, if you would, of the east and of the west. So remember, the Anasazi and the Hohokam, Anasazi primarily, are in New Mexico, Arizona, and further west. They are trading overland, so it's high-value items like Olivella shell, which comes from the Gulf of California, coming into Spiro. Lightweight, but high value because of the distance and the unique character of it. It's a sea snail, but it was used in beadwork in the eastern U.S. You have cotton coming out of the Four Corners area, we believe coming into Spiro through that network. So the folks in the Southwest are overland walking lightweight, high-value items out of the Gulf of California, up the Colorado Trade Network to the Four Corners, from the Four Corners to the Rio Grande Pueblos, from the Rio Grande Pueblos into the Alabates Quarry area. And from that point, the folks in the east were getting it through Spiro by river. And so it goes from the Alabates Quarry in Panhandle of Texas by water to Spiro. From Spiro, it goes out into the rest of the nation. So high-value items like the olivella, the cotton or cotton-like material anyway, is being woven into thread or spun into thread, and then that thread is being woven into cloth and especially lace, bobbin lace, beautiful pieces from Spiro. More fabric is preserved at Spiro than any other site in the nation. Incredible workmanship. But it would only been possible with that cotton coming out of the Four Corners area. And that's because of that trade network. Now, to the east, some of those high-value southwestern materials and plains materials were coming through, especially bison scapula, tibias, furs, and hides. But also, in the society, your society or your structure is matrifocal, matrilineal. So you trace your line of descent through your mother's side of the family. Matrilocal, meaning the man comes in when he gets married from outside the woman's home, because the women are the farmers. You're not going to move farmers around very much. So the men are producing about 15% of the diet, mainly large meat resources, deer, turkey, elk in our area. Women are producing 80 to 85% of the diet, mainly plant resources. So the city revolves around women farming those bottoms. For the men, they're hunting, working about 3 to 4 hours a day to produce that other 15% of the diet. Their main tools are going to be darts and atlatls, which they've been used since the Archaic period. An atlatl or throwing stick turns your arm into a catapult and allows for you to throw a short spear, in some cases a couple 100 yards. I mean, I know guys who can hit a target 200 yards away with great killing ability. Of course, it's not moving either. But the preferred tool for the men was bows and arrows. Now, you can make bows out of practically any kind of wood in the U.S., but when you're outside of the Spiro area, the wood you're using in order to get enough pull strength, poundage, would have to be thick, because the more times you bend it, the more times it's going to come to fracture on you. But you also have to be able to go and have it long and thick and heavy to get about 35 to 45 pounds of pull. Pound strength, the more pull number is, the greater the release energy, meaning the further away you can be from an animal with greater killing capacity. The single best bow-making wood in the nation is what the French referred to as bois d'arc, Osage orange, horseapple, which you can have a smaller bow. So a regular bow in the eastern U.S. was in between 5.5 to 6.5 feet long. Thick, had about 35 to 45 pounds of pull. A bow d'arc bow can be 4.5 to 5.5 feet tall. You're talking about men who are about 5'4" to 5'6" at that time on average height. So your bow is going to be taller than you are. And not only can bow d'arc bows can be thinner and smaller, but they can have 60 to 75 pounds of pull. So almost twice the amount of energy release, meaning hugely successful. Any guy worth his desire to hunt wanted a bow d'arc bow. But the only native stands of bow d'arc were in eastern Oklahoma, western Arkansas, Texas, and Louisiana, all controlled by the Caddoans, including Spiro and the Red River Valley. So if you were a guy, you wanted the miracle tool to make you work less. And that meant you had to deal with the monopoly that Spiro had. If you're a woman, you wanted something to be able to till the farms, because there's no draft animals. So everything's done by hand. And that's usually stone hoes. The big hose can be up to 6 pounds a piece plus a handle. But that gets really heavy after the full day of working. So the women wanted something that was lighter weight but very durable and kept an edge well. Bison scapulas are what they wanted. but the main herd of bison was in central Oklahoma, central Kansas, and northern part of Texas at that time. It meant that if you wanted bison material, including scapula, tibia, which is used as kind of a shovel, or dried furs, dried meats or furs or hides, the fur is skimmed off of the hide and then woven into cloth. So it's not just the material you see in TV and movies. It's much more complex than that. But if you wanted it, if you were a woman that wanted a 1 pound hoe that did the job of a 6 pound, you had to deal with Spiro because they held the monopoly. That's the economic underpinning of the Mississippian. If you don't have the economics, you're not going to be able to become that national connector. So using that economic power of the West, they were able to go and exert more influence because of that, and eventually able to have station their ambassadors, people from Spiro, stationed either at big cities or major resource areas like the southern tip of Florida, which is where the conch come from. The conch shell is a special type of conch called Bissicon perversum or contrarium. They're two subspecies. They go left-handed in their coiling as opposed to right-handed, which is what most of our whelks or conch have. Spiro wanted that. They wanted something that was identifiably unique and very narrow in where it was available because it was their equivalent of gold and diamonds. They also had an ambassador up in northeast Iowa, up in what's called effigy mounds on the upper portion of the Mississippi, because that way they got first dibs or control over. We don't know exactly how complex it was, but we definitely know they had first dibs on the copper coming out of the UP, the Upper Peninsula of the Lake Superior. And that copper is coming in nuggets, cold hammered in sheets, embossed with designs, and then they would be using them in ceremonies. Copper and conch shell to the Mississippian peoples have the same social value as gold and diamonds do in our society. And there's more of it at this one site than any other site in the nation. So that material, stone like the flint clay, which comes out of mostly eastern Missouri, there's quartz coming out of Arkansas, Missouri. There's copper coming out of northern Georgia. You name it. If you had a resource, Spiro ended up with at least a little bit of it that would tie together the people that were at Spiro to this rest of this nationwide confederation. Along with the writing system, this is what holds everything together. So the writing system, which is in the conch shell, allowed for Spiro, through iconography, picture writing, to be able to standardize the basic religious, political, and social ideas for the Mississippian peoples. Everything from how the world was created, where first fire comes from, major ceremonies like the busk or green corn, the rattlesnake dance, the black drink ceremony, heroes like Redhorn and Morning Star, monsters like Yuktana and Tawana, those are all depicted in the art because they're essentially creating the equivalent of the Bible. It allowed for this very diverse, extremely widespread population to share a commonality. That commonality even continues to today with the Mississippian traditions that are held by the groups that eventually end up in Oklahoma.
It's all fascinating. And, as we start to move into the more specifics, now that we have that excellent overview that you've given us, let's start to explore some of these ideas in a little bit more detail. So, when you discuss those, engraved shells that are telling a story, obviously it's not in an alphabet that we're used to thinking of today. It's more of iconography that is providing talking points for the narrative. So as these pieces are moving out through across the network of trade from Spiro, give us an idea of how those stories are being spread through that iconography and the power that they have that leads back to Spiro.
Sure. Well, keep in mind that prior to the time that this Mississippian art, the things that we're finding at Spiro, started to be created, the ideas, the storylines probably had already existed. Other mound periods like the Adena and the Hopewell had some of those ideas floating around. Not as widespread, probably not as standardized as what we see during the Mississippian, but that's really because Spiro and the Mississippian is more complex anyway. So you have these ideas that are being orally transmitted. But oral transmission, and most information is that way until, Europeans come in, really. So if you wanted an idea that was being standardized, it was going to be difficult because oral information distorts with time and distance. And it has authority issues. I mean, how do you know the person coming in saying they're from Spiro is really from Spiro? And the conch shell overcomes both of those issues. The conch, because it's a special type of left-handed whorl, occurring pretty much only in the Gulf Coast of Florida in the tip, and Spiro having an ambassador there so they get first access or direct access to it, meant that if you have somebody coming in with a conch shell, even if it hadn't been engraved, it wouldn't have mattered. It still is a high-value item. It's special. It's like having a presidential seal, which predetermines acceptance of the information. But the iconography, the imagery that we see in the shell engravings is that real meat of the storyline. So it's kind of like when you go into a cathedral in Europe before, something from the 11 or 1200s, most people didn't read and write. But a priest who knows the stories, has the ability to read, can tell the same stories. And in those stained glass windows or those statues and icons within the sanctuary, say he was going to do a story about John the Baptist. He can point to that image, and within that image is the components of his storyline, just like the conch shell engravings are the components of the storylines that they wanted to make sure everybody was singing off of. So the first fire story. The first fire is important because it's the sacred fire that burned in all the temples of the eastern U.S. It is the symbol of the sun on earth, and the sun is the most powerful spiritual entity. So it's very important that everybody shares where it comes from, why it's important. So the storyline is that there's a water spider who goes, and when the first fire is brought to earth, it's in a lightning, they're twins, they're also tricksters, send a bolt of lightning down and catch a sycamore tree on fire. And then all the other animals are trying, because this is before humans existed, but all the other animals are trying to get to it. They all get burned terribly. It's why the black snake is black. It's why owls have their feathers away from their eyes and only can go during the nighttime because they burn, the smoke filled their eyes, things like that. But all of that information is in the iconography, or at least the basis of it. So you have a water spider who is the bringer of fire, and in the middle of her abdomen is what the Cherokee referred to as the Tusti bowl, which is a sacred bowl that they would carry the first fire in. And in the middle of it is an equidistant cross, which is the symbol of the sun. So all of those components are a part of that iconography in that shell engraving. Now, some of them have more elaborate stories that are involved in it, but basically that's the storyline. And so an artisan would create that on the conch shell, engrave it into the conch shell. So they engrave it into this beautiful pearly white engraving. Well, that's not enough in terms of trying to catch people's attention. So what do? They take grease, bear grease mostly, and charcoal and blend it into a paste, and that becomes the filling for those engraved lines. So you have this pearly white shell, beautiful material, huge. I mean, some of them are 2 foot long and about 7-8 inches in diameter. So they're really impressive. So it's engraved into the conch shell and then filled in all those lines with this black, very, very bright black that brings all that information out to the surface. A messenger would then be told what that means until they have it down pat. I mean, they've told it over and over and over again until they can retell it without any distortions. Then they get into a boat and say they were going up to Cahokia. That means down the Arkansas River and up the Mississippi, all the way to East St. Louis. Along the way, if they had information that would be disseminated among everybody, they would stop at a town, show them the conch shell. Well, only the leaders at Spiro have access to this conch shell. So they know it's an official missive. This is the presidential seal. Predetermines people's acceptance of the information. He would then tell the local folks what that shell meant, what the leader at Spiro wanted them to know, until they have it down pat. Now, in some cases, they use other media, pieces of pottery, stone, wood, to replace that, so they'll copy it. And that becomes their own copy of the first fire story. Then it goes from town to town to town, and finally finds Cahokia. There he goes to the ambassador of Spiro that's in Cahokia, takes that shell to that ambassador, tells him what the leader at Spiro wants him to know. It then transfers ownership to those high-value individuals, those ambassadors. The more important your position is, the more of these kinds of things you'll end up with. They represent your status in this life, but they also will represent your status in the afterlife. So the local ambassador would receive the information, then tell the leader in the local area at Cahokia, up on Monk's Mound, tell them what the leader at Spiro wanted to know. It may be orally transmitted after that point, or it may be that it ends up being replicated in other media, but it'll go further and further afield. Now, for a time, until it's in the state, it's stable in terms of the telling of it, you can always refer back and say, nope, here's the original story. Let's get it back, and that way it gets part of the social iconography, becomes part of the history. It also acts as that leader's status. And when that leader or that ambassador dies, their body and all the things that show their status, the copper, the conch shell, the stone, the fabrics, whatever it was, is going to be brought back here and eventually interred in the one burial mound, what we call the Craig Mound. Over an 800-year period, over 1,100 leaders were interred there layer upon layer upon layer until you end up with a mound the same size as a football field, over 350 feet long, over 115 feet wide, the highest point about 34 feet high. And along with those bodies go millions and millions of artifacts, unparalleled anywhere else in the nation.
So the language that they, or the writing system that they came up with, is it influenced from other places, maybe from down south, or is it entirely unique to Spiro?
It's not influenced from Mesoamerica, but they are trying to do the same thing here that other cultures do at the same level of political sophistication. This is what we call a pre-state, post-chieftain social system, meaning that the leaders have more importance than and more power than, say, a mayor would or even a governor would, but less power than, say, a president or a king would. They can't dictatorially tell everybody what to do. They have to get everybody on board with it. And again, that's why the writing is so important. It allows for everybody to share this commonality. But it also basically, when you're dealing with this Mississippian tradition, it's a good question, because this has been a controversy ever since Spiro was discovered in the 1930s. For people who want to see Mesoamerican influence, there are similarities. Part of it is because they're trying to deal with the same issues. How do you control a vast group of people with an ideology? The imagery will be very similar because at the same level of political sophistication. So the political system is what we call a pre-state, post-chieftain social system. The leaders have more power than, say, a mayor would, but less power than, say, a king would. They can't dictatorially say, you're going to believe this. Instead, you're using the conch shell engravings as a way of creating a commonality. Now, if you looked at the Maya, or at about 400 years, 300 to 400 years earlier than what we see at Spiro, you would have seen very similar art, because they're at that basically the same political development period. Now, at the same time, the Maya, the Aztec, they're state-level societies. Very different kinds of controls, and the art reflects that. So at the same time, the Maya, the Aztec do not have the same kinds of art as what we see here at Spiro. However, when you're dealing with the Mississippian, you do have ideas that are coming out of the Hopewell and the Adena periods, some 300 to 500, 600 years earlier. So the ideas would have been continuous, but the writing system, the art, is not. It's really a manifestation of that big city interconnectivity that's going to occur. Now, if you look at the art at Spiro and look at the people depicted, Spiro's unique in a lot of ways. First, because it's a writing system, but also because the art depicts people in a very naturalistic form. Most Native Americans here in the U.S. anyway, before Europeans come in, when they depict people, they do it in an abstract form. Stick figures, exaggerations. And while they do that here too, they also have extremely naturalistic forms, which means when you're looking at the art, you're looking at the equivalent of a 1,000-year-old photo album. We don't have to guess at Spiro what people saw themselves as looking like. They show us. So when you're looking at the Big Boy pipe, which is one of the effigy pipes, or if you're looking at some of the conch shell engravings, you're looking at people that lived 1,000 years or so ago. We get to see the things that normally decay very rapidly in most other archaeological sites. Most of the time when you're dealing with other sites and you ask an archaeologist, what do the people like? They're going to be looking, if they're lucky, at bones. And your bones can tell me a lot about you. But they don't make up those very specific differences. I mean, we've got 4 people here, and yet each of us is an individual. We're all males, and yet we're each different. And because of the art at Spiro, we get to see those individual qualities. But we also get those commonalities that all Native Americans share. North, Central, and South America share a genetic heritage. That means they are closer related one with another than they are with any old world group. That means the phenotypes, the facial and body characteristics, are more or less shared between that entire region. However, think of it as a bell curve. So if you were down in South America with the Inca, most of their population is going to be on one part of that bell curve, but they will have individuals across the entire run. The Cherokee up in the Carolinas, their population mostly will be on another part of that bell curve, but they will have individuals that will run along the entirety. Because of the art at Spiro, because of that naturalistic depiction of people, we get to see a wider a part of that physiological aspect of the people, of the Caddoan people predominantly, but also those groups that are outside of Spiro. We get to see body tattooing, hairstyles, eye styles, body painting. I mean, you name it, the clothing that they're wearing, the ceremonies that they depict, all are in that art. No other place in the U.S., except for maybe a piece here and a piece there outside of Spiro, has that opportunity. We can make that 1,000-year-old contact that no other place in the nation has the opportunity to.
So speaking of, transmission of cultural information and just context and language and that type of thing, what is the origin of the word Spiro?
The name of Spiro is attached to it, to the Mound site in the 1930s. Now, the city of Spiro was established in 1897 when the railroad comes across the Arkansas River and they establish a water spot there. It was named after one of the original people who lived in the town of Spiro. So in 1897, 98, and it was either the first postmistress's maiden name, or another possibility is that it was the name of the son of a banker in Fort Smith, and they named it after him trying to get the bank to relocate into Spiro. Didn't work, but they got it stuck on a map, and you can't get rid of it after that. So in the 1930s, 1933, a local group of treasure hunters, calling themselves the Pecola Mining Company, got a hold of the lease on the burial mound at Spiro. They got a hold of it because they believed that was where the Spanish gold was going to be hidden. A story told for every county in Oklahoma, almost every county west of Mississippi, and does not exist in any of them. But it was the Depression, 1930s. There weren't any jobs, and from all accounts, these guys were not looking hard for jobs. They wanted to strike it rich. So they got a hold of the lease on the burial mound and started digging into it, of course, looking for Indian art, looking for gold and silver, which meant that the things they found, bones, stacks of cloth, bushel loads of seed pearls, copper, conch shell, you name it, there's more of it here than anywhere else, was initially of no interest to them. I mean, they were using some of the bones and 1,000-year-old cedars they were finding in the burials as firewood during the winter of 33 and the spring of 34. But once local folks started coming out to see what they'd found and seeing just thousands and thousands of artifacts strewn along the flank, but not a piece of gold or silver one, said, I'll give you a nickel for that or a dime for that. Well, even back in the 30s, it was like not very much money even then. But the commercial diggers needed to recoup the lease money. So they started digging up the burials and selling the artifacts to whoever wanted to buy it. Very quickly, buyers all over the world were saying, man, that stuff is really different. This, back in the 30s, was called the King Tut of the West because nobody had ever seen anything like it before or since. Not only the amount, millions of artifacts, but also because of the unique artistic forms that were coming out and the preservation of perishables like fabric, basketry, copper, conch shell, things like that. So in 1933, everybody could get it, 34 really, anybody could buy it. Everybody wanted it. And the commercial diggers were selling it hand over fist. Now, they'd never made much money. It was the buyers who then resold it who did. But literally anywhere you go, there will be something from Spiro in a collection nearby. From the Smithsonian to UCLA, University of Chicago, the University of Texas, all over Oklahoma and Arkansas. Overseas in the Louvre in Paris, the British Museum in London, National Museum in Germany, Yugoslavia, Saudi Arabia, Buenos Aires, Peking, Japan, Taiwan, Korea, literally everywhere, which is why in 1935, Oklahoma becomes one of the very first states in the nation to pass laws to stop that destruction and close down the commercial digs. But this was still privately owned land. This is Choctaw freedmen allotments. Ex-slaves of the Choctaw Nation had been farming it since the 1870s, so there was no way of adequately protecting it. That's why in 1936, the University of Oklahoma, with help from the Oklahoma Historical Society, the University of Tulsa, and private donors like Frank Phillips of Phillips 66 fame, came in and started scientific excavation of what remained of the burial mound. 738 burials were recovered, millions of artifacts, most of which now are at OU in curatorship for the Wichita and the Caddo. This is when Spiro, the name, gets associated with the mounds. That the Spiro Mounds, because Spiro was the closest town on any map, during the latter part of the commercial digs and then all through the university work, that's the name it gets associated with.
Okay, so, and not to get too far afield, that was actually very interesting, but it's all part of the tapestry of the history of this site.
Yeah, it's all fascinating how it comes together, but let's turn our attention now to Spiro proper and the archaeology of the site. So now that we have a better understanding of how it came about and the intricate moving parts of it, how many mounds do we have here, and what are sort of the claims to fame as far as your most important artifacts? I mean, obviously, the shells that we've discussed are a big part of the history here because it's something that's so closely identified with the site. But let's begin with the layout. How many mounds are here, and what has been the history of the archaeology from a scientific standpoint versus the looters?
So the site itself, what we incorporate is 150 acres. That includes the 12 mounds and a portion of the elite city. So there were about 50 households, about 500 folks, both on and off the property that we control now. And those would be like the president and Congress, the rich and famous part of town. The city itself covered over 5 square miles, had about 7,000 to 10,000 people for over 1,000 continuous years, farming the bottoms, living mainly on the terraces edges. These are Caddoan speakers, so they eventually become parts of the only 2 tribes native to Oklahoma and western Arkansas, which are the Caddo along the Red River Valley and the Arkansas Valley Caddoans, which become parts of the Wichita and the Keetchai. So this area had these 12 mounds. All of them are man-made. They are also all accretional mounds, meaning that they're built not all at once, but layer upon layer upon layer. So the longer an area is used, the more times it's added to, the taller and bigger it'll become. Most of the mounds, 9 of them, are house mounds created for the primary leader's home to be built upon. So if you had the president and Congress, you'd have 50 households out here, but only the primary leader's home would have been built on top of a mound. Again, it's a way of saying I'm in charge and you're not. The house mounds are not only accretional, layer upon layer upon layer, but they're also sequential. So you end up with 9 house mounds, but only one of those would actually be in use at any one time. So before 850 AD, there were 500 folks here. The house that the primary leader was in was built on the ground surface. Somewhere about 20, 30 years later, they apparently died, and they start the process. That leader's home is destroyed. It's burned down. They bring in basket loads of dirt to cover where that old house used to be for about a foot and a half thick, flatten the top, slope the sides, so it looks like a very small cut-off pyramid of dirt. Then they built the next leader's house on top of that small mound. Used that until that person's death, destroyed it, covered over, built another one on top of it. After about 3 to 4 house constructions, and it varies from mound to mound, but at some point they decide this is as tall as it needs to be. So they would, when that leader died, destroy the house, cover it over, flatten and sloped it. But instead of building the next leader's house in the same spot again, they go to a new location and start the whole process over. After 3 or 4, they go to another one and another one and another one. The temple mounds, the 2 on the upper terrace, are built similarly, only over a much longer period of time. And the structure isn't a house. It's a combination of cathedral, Supreme Court building, and the Capitol complex. They make the rules there, they drive the religious system, and they coordinate the economic and political structure of the society there. The temple mound and the burial mound are used over roughly the same, the primary temple mound, brown mound, is used over the same period of time as the burial mound, the Craig mound. Starts about 700 before the mound ever existed. Then the mounds from about 800, 850 on up till 1500 are constructed layer upon layer upon layer. The burial mound, there's only one, had over 1,100 leaders over an 800-year period, and the mound ends up, like I said, over 350 feet long and 34 feet high. It's a big mound, which is why the commercial diggers were thinking that that's where all that gold and silver is going to be found, which it wasn't, but it was an incredible find. So when you have these mounds, again, mounds, regardless of where you are created as a way of saying who's in charge and who's not. This is the cultural center not only of the area, but of basically the nation. This is Washington, D.C. It's by no means the largest city. Cahokia up in East St. Louis is by far bigger, but its influence is less, especially from 1100 on, than what Spiro's is. Moundville and Etowah, over in the eastern part of the Mississippian system, they're in the 30,000 range probably. So they're about 2 to 3 times the bigger than Spiro is. But for this region, Spiro is the big city, so it had the same kind of rough influence as the rest. So you have this highly interconnected mound-building society that have 250,000 people in the Arkansas Valley, another 250,000 or so in the Red River Valley that are all under its importance, its power. And then they, in turn, exert that influence over the rest of the nation through their mound sites. This is very independent, but also interconnected.
Yeah, again, as we look at the entire system, it's fascinating how each individual place plays a role in the overall world of the Mississippian. But again, that uniqueness of Spiro. Now, the setup here, having been to some of these other sites myself, is very similar, but it's striking how Spiro is really not that large in scope of acreage and the amount of mounds, but yet the influence is exponential based off of everything that we've discussed so far. Now, there have been some very interesting artifacts found here over the years. So the big boy pipe that is also very well known, one of those Missouri flint clay pipes that were basically believed to come out of Cahokia, and that was found here, or is that still controversial?
Found here. We mentioned earlier when we were talking before the broadcast that you get 2 archaeologists in the room and you'll have a minimum of 3 opinions that are going on. Cahokia, it's like people from New York City. They like to see themselves as the center of all universes. And they are important, but they are not the center of this universe. The Mississippian period, Spiro has more influence, and those artifacts represent that. Now, there are some things that were being created in other sites. Over in the Cumberland Gap area, we have pipes that are used in ceremonies, which are definitely created for ceremonies in that area that ended up here. Probably because they were a part of the ceremonial structure that those ambassadors in that area were a part of. So when the ambassador died, the things that they used in ceremonies, regardless of where they originated from, come with them and end up being interred here. Flint clay occurs in eastern Missouri. Now, where the artisans actually create them is another thing altogether. Cahokia by far has the next largest amount of these big effigy pipes. Spiro has the most. Now, Cahokia likes to see it as because that's where it all was created. I think it's more complex than that. There are pieces that were created in that area following in workshops, probably not on Cahokia itself, but on the supporting city systems that are around it. Same way with other pieces as well, stone and things like that. Cahokia sees all of Spiro stuff and most of the Mississippian South stuff as being created there and then adulterated, made into pipes. There was one archaeologist from Cahokia who basically said we're all smoking fiends in the South, and they were heavily focused on that as a ceremonial material. Tobacco is very important in the Mississippian iconography and in the ceremonial life for the Mississippians, is historically as well. But most of those pipes probably came in a block. So they carved out of the flint clay hills these blocks of flint clay. Now, when flint clay first comes out of the deposit, it's relatively soft. But as it ages, as it loses moisture, it becomes harder and harder and harder. So it would have been coming in a block and then traded, going by waterway up to Spiro, I believe. Because the iconography, the identity of these pieces of art is unique to Spiro. There are similarities, but it is so much more diverse here than it is anywhere else. Some ideas, like the corn woman, which is found at Cahokia, are repeated here, not in flint clay, but in other materials. So the same ideas are being reflected. Some of the artisan forms may have been influencing each other, but I think that we're seeing different workshops and different master artists, especially when you're dealing with the places like Spiro and Cahokia. Those are probably where your two primaries are. The neat thing about Spiro is that you end up with cross-media art. So at Cahokia, you get these pipes, but at Spiro, you get pipes and conch shell and copper and fabric, which have the same ideology, the same stylistics being depicted. And you don't get that really very much anywhere else. A piece here, piece there, but it's really minimal. So are they very connected? Yes. Is it only occurring at Cahokia and then getting shipped out everywhere else? Cahokia, one of the archaeologists said that we had at the end of Cahokia's reign, which was about 1150, that there may have been a big garage sale and all the fancy stuff from Cahokia ended up being spread all over. I don't think that's the case. Maybe a piece or two, but not the wholesale that we see here. And the iconography, the art is so interesting and goes across these media forms that I think that you have a master and you have workshops that are under that master that have different artists focusing in on different media. So a stone worker, there may be a copper worker or a group of copper workers. There's fabric weavers that are including all this same iconography. It's very, very interesting.
You know, often people think about, at least in these conversations, they think about Cahokia as almost the capital of the Mississippian world. And I couldn't help but think, was there any proof or any discussion about whether these different areas that are set up as the hubs at Moundville, Etowah, Spiro, did they require any governance or approval from someone at Cahokia to develop and distribute certain aspects?
As far as we're aware, no. They're all independent, and they are developing independently as you gain power, gain population, there are sharing of ideas. But around the time that Cahokia's influence is disintegrating because of an environmental change and the interloping of groups to the north down, including the Illinois, to usurp their power structure, when that happens, the South rises in power. And it's due primarily because those three groups, Moundville, Etowah, and Spiro, start exerting more influence, not only on our own area, but more influence on that northern range as well. So did Cahokia, because it's a big city, have influence? Yes. Did it have premier influence? It's tough to say 100% with archaeology, but I don't see it. I see it as important, but not the premier side. I mean, Spiro isn't either. It isn't only power-based here. Our influence is about that ideas exchange, their trade connections. Their population is minuscule compared to Cahokia, but they're also in an isolated form. Cahokia, Moundville, Etowah, they're trying to control areas that have no familial relationship to them, have no linguistic relationship to them. It's just a regional zone. And as a result, there's a little bit more aggression. There's also more complexity in their interactions. But Spiro, we're all Cadoans in the Arkansas and the Red River valleys. We have a barrier of the Ozarks to the north and the Ouachitas to the south from folks who are coming in from the outside, influencing us directly or trying to take over our just incredible economic system. The other groups, they have more problems with that. And so you have a lot more interactions that are not always real nice with each other with Moundville, Etowah, and especially Cahokia. But at Spiro, you get a more unified view. And I think that had an importance. The smaller population size means that they have maize as a part of their food diet, maize being a complex carbohydrate. It's not real great for you because we don't process it very well, but it requires lye to break it down, making hominy to start the breakdown process. But that microfine amounts of lye further reduce the absorption of proteins and trace elements from other foods. So the bigger your city is, the more you rely upon maize, but the more you rely upon maize, the greater the deterioration of your body is. So the folks at Spiro were slightly taller than average. They were a little bit longer lived than average. They had more of their children surviving, as far as we can tell. They had less dentition wear. They had fewer cavities, which meant, say you had the leaders from Spiro, Cahokia, Moundville, and Etowah. I don't know if this is the case, but if they were in a meeting together and they decide to have a lunch out, the other guys, because they're going to be in their later years, the average life expectancy was about 40 to 45, somewhere in there. Spiro was probably a little bit more than that. But most of the rest of them are going to only have about half their teeth or less. Because when you had a cavity, you didn't drill and fill, you pulled it, which means you may not be able to eat much steak. So the guy from Spiro, he's eating steak, chowing down, and all these other guys are eating gruel. And they're saying, there must be something special about those folks at Spiro. They're not creating palisades and moats around their city. They're not having to deal with most of their kids dying. They're not having to deal with their teeth falling out. Instead, they've got a blessed life. And now they're creating this art, and they're writing the things down, and they're helping us understand how the world works, how the cosmos interacts. To me, I think that's a part of the reason why Spiro became so influential. Not because of its size, not because of its military might, but because they economically had power and they religiously were able to put it down on this very unique iconography so that everybody is sharing that ideology.
Yeah, the site here, the power, the economics, the political arrangements, it's all incredibly fascinating, but as all great things do, it eventually comes to an end. So take us to the events that happened globally, regionally, that sort of brought about the close of the Mississippian culture.
Well, to understand that, you have to understand how the Mississippian came into existence. And the reason they did is because around 700 AD, from California to Virginia, from the southern half of Colorado to northern Mexico, the U.S. experienced an incredibly lush period of time. And not just more rain, but a much longer growing season, very predictable rainfall patterns, roughly 6, 7, 8 years out of every decade were bumper crop yields. Add to that the reintroduction of maize, and you just had the prime opportunity for this national confederation to exist. And while they're existing, while things are thriving, the elites are saying, the people in charge are saying, the reason all this good stuff is happening is because of us guys. We're the ones communicating with the spiritual world. We're the ones coordinating all you ignorant farmers. We're the ones creating the storage facilities because inevitably you guys are going to make a mistake. And while we're trying to figure out how to fix the problem to appease the spiritual world, we've got something to fall back on because we're smart and you need us. And it worked. More years than not were bumper crop yields. Now, for Cahokia, that time of plenty collapses at 1100. They go into an environmental shift, a drought cycle. Didn't lack rain as much as they did a change in the cyclicity, the pattern of rainfall, which for bottomland farmers is not a good thing. You need to have predictability. You need to have crops that you plant mature. And that was a problem when you have this massive flooding episodes that were occurring. The South kept going until about 1300. At 1300, the entire U.S., little pockets here and here may not have been affected, but almost the entirety of the U.S. goes into an environmental shift, a drought cycle. Again, not a lack of rain as much as it is a change in the cyclicity. Although since 1300, the U.S. has been incrementally but progressively drier. So it has a little bit about that. But it's really about these torrential rainfall patterns that occur in the late spring, early summer, where you've already got crops in the ground, and now you get these 6 months worth of rain in a single month that just inundates what you've got, strips them out or dumps so much silt that it just rots them in the ground. Your surpluses plummet. Well, during the good times, the elites are saying the reason for all this good stuff is us. We're the ones who do all the stuff to make sure everybody's living a good life. And now you've got 100 years where more years than not out of a decade are not producing surplus anymore. Instead, you've got a deficit. People are saying, what's going on? You said you could fix these problems. Ain't working. And eventually, you go through a series of problems. People in elite structures try to coordinate the problems that they have. First step is always denial of problem. This is just a bad year. If you do what we tell you, it'll be back on track in no time at all. But after a generation, 20, 30 years, people say it ain't going back. So the elites step it up. They try to figure out who's to blame besides the people in charge. For the folks here, that included movement of animals into our area that normally weren't here. The armadillo coming out of central Texas because of the environmental shift. The jaguar coming out of central Texas into the southeast. We don't have jaguars in this drought cycle. We've been in a drought cycle that is almost identical to what we experienced at 1300, and we've been experiencing since the 1970s. Although at 1300, I can guarantee you there were no internal combustion engines because the sun and the oceans are to blame for most of our problems. Well, that's what the elites today do. Anyway, so the elites 1,000 years ago were saying, these animals are moving in and we're having the same problems, these big problems. Well, obviously, it's cause and effect. These animals, or rather their spiritual power, are causing the problems. They show up in the art in part because they figured out the problem, and they're going to use those to identify it for everybody else, but also to use in ceremonies to say, we need you to not do this, to fix it. Didn't work. You go into step 3. Step 3 is consolidation of power away from individuals and small entities into centralized power authorities. So what we see is those single mound sites, those county seats, there become fewer of them. Same with the state capital sites, because they're consolidating their power in fewer nodes, but also the storage facilities are now in fewer places, meaning that if you don't get along with the elites, you don't get fed. which is a big way every culture in the world has used to reinforce who's in charge and who's not. But eventually, the elites, after a century almost of drought cycles, people stop believing in them. They basically say, we've been giving you this time. You've been telling us what to do. It ain't working. And if it's not working, why are we supporting you? And eventually, the Mississippian is abandoned as a national confederation. Now, the people are still there. They're still alive. They're still doing roughly the same things, but you see them decentralized. So they go into smaller river valleys. They're still farming, but their focus is now on local and regional rather than national connections. And so the national system, the mound building, the use of the writing system, when no longer people believe in it, falls by the wayside. Now, every culture in the East that was a part of the Mississippian did carry on bits and pieces of those old ways, but no group in the historic period continues the entirety that we see in the Mississippian at Spiro, Moundville, Etowah, Cahokia.
And as we near the end here, so kind of as a final thought, we understand now how the Mississippian came about and then how it eventually faded away. How was that end of the Mississippian represented here in the mounds at Spiro?
Well, when the environmental change is occurring, of course, this is kind of like the capital. So everybody is looking to Spiro for an explanation. The conch shell engravings, the identity of those animals as being a part of the problem, is a part of the way that we understand it. But at about 1350, the heart of that 100-year drought cycle, the elites here at Spiro say, man, the old ways are not working. They've been doing the same ceremonies, or roughly the same, for almost 400 years. And now the energy, the power is gone away. It's just not working anymore. So at 1350, they decide that they're going to retire the old and try to restart the political, social, and religious system. So you can't just throw away all these objects of power, the conch shell, the copper, the stone pieces that have been used in ceremonies and as iconography or whatever since the 900s. You've got to retire them, send them into the afterlife. Well, what is the afterlife representation? The portal between this world and the afterlife is the burial mound. So on top of the burial mound, and just like all the other mounds, it is an accretional mound, layer upon layer upon layer, flat-topped, sloped on the sides when it's not in construction. On the biggest lobe, the northwest portion of that mound, it's got 4 humps on it, they build a round structure. It's just poles put into the ground and then tied up at the top. And it's about 16 feet in diameter. They go and have a huge ceremony, a retirement ceremony. They go and they create this round circle of structure. And then out of the temple, once you have this big thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people showing up for this funeral of the past, they pick up the materials that have been in very special places in the temple. Every time they go and they build a new temple, they place those objects in the same locations, north, south, east, and west. Now, there's some regalia that doesn't really have an orientation, but it's there, and they're going to retire it too. They bring it all out of the temple and take it over and place it inside of this structure. Just poles at that point, but they bring it in, they place it in the same orientations. At the end of that ceremony, they plaster it with clay, just like they would a regular house. And then over the ensuing 150 years, until about 1500, layer upon layer upon layer of burials are continued to place on the burial mound. And eventually encase that entire structure, that ceremonial retirement of the old, and eventually cover it entirely. Which is why when the commercial diggers dug into the burial mound, that particular area, they dig into that central chamber, or what's also referred to as the spirit lodge, which had almost perfect preservation. And all of these objects, all this power that had been used from 900 to 1350 is extracted by the commercial digs, spread all over the world. That power is in museums everywhere, and it still has power today. In fact, artists throughout the U.S. utilize Spiro designs, because it's really the only place you're going to get it, because it ties them today with 1,000 years in the past. It still has the same power that the Mississippians exerted on the people who were Mississippians today. I mean, it just ties everything together so incredibly.
Well put. It is truly a powerful and inspirational site, and a true honor for both Chasing History and 7 Ages to be here with you today. We've been speaking with Dennis Peterson, archaeologist and manager of the Spiro Mounds Archaeological Center. It's been a great interview. We thank you for your time. Tell everyone where they can find you, more information about you online, and do you any volunteer programs, anything that you have here?
Look us up at okhistory.org and go to the sites page, and we're on there. We're part of the Oklahoma Historical Society. You can also look us up at on our Facebook page, Spiro Mounds Archaeological Center. I do posts practically every day on a number of different topics. And then if you want to email us, you can contact us at spiro@okhistory.org. The site itself is open Wednesday through Saturday from 9 to 5, noon to 5 on Sunday. We're closed Mondays and Tuesdays. We do have an admission cost, but it's really pretty small when you're looking at the importance of the site. It is in eastern Oklahoma, 7 miles outside of Spiro, Oklahoma, off of Highway 9-271. So it's just about 3 hours from Oklahoma City, about 10 minutes from Fort Smith, Arkansas.
Excellent. So, yes, we encourage everyone to please go out there and support all of your local archaeological sites and come by here at Spiro, spend some time with Dennis, and learn about this very, very important North American site. On behalf of Chasing History, Chase Pipes, James Waldo, Micah Hanks, I am Jason Pentrail. Thank you all for joining us on this very special edition of 7 Ages Audio Journal. Again, we want to thank Dennis Peterson for that interview. It was a real honor to get out there. He gave us really the entire day when we were at Spiro Mounds. It was sad in a way because, no one else really showed up that day. And Dennis did mention that after COVID, that their numbers of attendance had greatly declined. So again, we encourage everybody to get out there and see these sites. They desperately need the interest. They need people coming out to visit. And it's important, again, to get out there and see these sites. This one, again, as you learned in this interview, is such a significant site to the story of North America. So much more was happening there. The center of influence from Spiro Mounds was vast. And so one of the things that I learned from Dennis that really stood out to me was just how intricate the system of ambassadors and representation of these individual sites really was. And it makes you really think about the Mississippian time period in a whole new light. It's something that I'm really excited about, and I'm really looking forward to getting back out there and seeing some of the other Mississippian sites that we didn't have a chance, such as Parkin Mounds, Winterville, some of the other sites out there. Very much looking forward to getting back to that part of the country, and we certainly thank Dennis for a fantastic interview.
Indeed, and let me know when you decide to head out that way. I'll probably be stateside next time, and I'll be ready to hitch up and head out with you. A couple other points, too, by the way. Again, I realize not everybody can travel and is able to go or are near enough to these kinds of sites that they can visit. The other side of it, too, is a lot of people don't even know what kinds of heritage sites may be near their homes. I mean, get on Google and look around for, archaeological sites, heritage sites, historic monuments and things in your area. You may be surprised at what's right close to your home We hear from people all the time, oh yeah, that golf course over there? Had no idea those were Indian mounds. Yeah, well, surprise, surprise. And that's part of the tragedy. A lot of this has just been covered up in the modern era. People don't know what is literally in their backyard. So, find out about that. And if you take this seriously, if you enjoy this podcast, we encourage you to become involved in being a steward to the protection of these sites. Let other people know that these sites are important, that they must be preserved. The other side of it too, in light of the pandemic, I've got a lot of friends in recent days who have contracted COVID-19. This pandemic is still ongoing, and in my opinion, one of the best things you can do if you are concerned about being in close proximity to people and being around large crowds, get out there in the country, visit one of these archaeological sites. It's a fun and safe way to get out there and enjoy some summertime outside in the wild and in recognition of the ancient prehistory of the Americas. So, Jason, thank you so much for sitting down, and thank you for that wonderful interview with Dennis Peterson.
My pleasure. You will never hear me complain about getting out to these sites. I'm always excited and looking forward to the next trip. Hopefully something coming up this fall, and then certainly again by next spring for sure. Have the entire team back together, and we hope to get out there and see some of you folks on the road.
Indeed. Well, I'm already missing James Waldo, so hopefully we can drag him along too and get all of us out there, get the band back together, as they say. So again, thanks to all you guys out there for listening to this podcast, for supporting our efforts, and for keeping up with what the 7 Ages Audio Journal is working to produce, and of course the issues we always try to bring awareness to. Thanks to our sponsors at the Smoky Mountain Relic Room. I'm Micah Hanks. He is Jason Pentrail. And on behalf of all of us here at the 7 Ages Research Team, we'll catch you guys next time here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.